Thank you for that warm introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As the moderator said, I am Areva Martin, and I'm going to host this really important panel today, and I'm delighted to be back with you all. This is not my first rodeo, so I'm always excited to join the National Forum of Black Public Administrators. You guys are one of my favorite groups. Shout out to the president and to the entire board. Always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. We were here last year talking about city government and how city government and county governments could move the needle on issues related to African Americans as it related to businesses and enterprises. And now, a year later, we're here talking about the incredible attacks on DEI and other initiatives. I am delighted to be joined by 4 of the nation's leading experts on this topic, and not only are those of you who are in the room participating in this conversation, but we have thousands of folks who are going to be tuning in virtually as we are live streaming this conversation on multiple social media platforms, because this conversation is so incredibly important and has the attention of pretty much anyone working in both the public and private space. So with that, I'm going to bring to the stage the panelists. First, Dr. Michael Fontroy. He's an associate professor of policy and government and the founding director of the Race, Politics, and Policy Center at George Mason University. He's also the author of More Than Just Race, Conservatism and Black Voter Suppression. Please join me on the stage, Dr. Fontroy. Next is Fatima Gilliam. She is the founder of the Azara Group, which provides strategic advisory services to Fortune 500 companies. She's also an attorney and the author of a new book called Race Rules: What Your Black Friend Won't Tell You. And she's going to be signing copies of her new book after this talk on the 3rd floor. Welcome, Fatima. Next on our panel is Rodney Strong. He is the CEO of Griffin & Strong PC. This is an Atlanta-based law firm where he specializes in law and public policy consulting. Please welcome to the stage Rodney Strong. And last but not least is Naeem Jenkins Nixon. He is the Deputy Director of the White House Initiative for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Welcome, Naeem. All right. An esteemed panel of experts. Before we start with the questions, I just want to read to you some of the headlines. I've been tracking this now for several months, collecting some of the headlines, and just here are a couple that caught my attention. The Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote about the tyranny of the DEI bureaucracy, saying DEI offices have become speech police and weapons to intimidate and limit speech. Kevin McCarthy, former House Speaker, tweeted that critical race theory goes against everything Martin Luther King Jr. taught us. Okay. After the Supreme Court's ruling gutting DEI or gutting admissions for affirmative action in college admissions, high-profile Republicans began issuing threats. Republican Tom Cotton sent letters to 51 law firms claiming the legality of corporate DEI programs was now in question. A group of 13 Republican attorney generals sent a letter to Fortune 100 CEOs threatening legal consequences. And Stephen Miller's America First Legal made a similar threat in a letter to 200 law school deans. And here's a name you all have heard, Bill Ackman. Bill told the Washington Post that DEI efforts and diversity trainings are the root cause of anti-Semitism. Christopher Rufo, after helping to push out Harvard President Claudine Gay, celebrated with a tweet that said, "Game on." He told Fox host Jesse Waters, pushing out Claudine Gay, toppling the president, of Harvard University for a journalist like me is a big, big win. And if I were on the left, this would be Pulitzer Prize winning material. The accusations are growing more extreme, and as you can hear, more nonsensical, with people inextricably blaming DEI efforts for events like the Boeing plane that lost a panel in flight, like the collapse of the bridge right here in Baltimore. Indeed, after the bridge's collapse, Republicans said if Governor Wes Moore spent more time focused on infrastructure than on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that bridge would still be standing. I have to read one more for you. Utah Republican Phil Lyman, who is a state representative and is running for governor, he's one of the main attackers, saying that the Port of Baltimore Commissioner, Corinthia Barber, a Black woman whose biography mentions consulting work related to DEI, he wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter, "This is what happens when you have governors who prioritize diversity over the well-being and security of citizens." He then wrote in a follow-up post, "DEI equals DIE." So needless to say, DEI is under attack, and the attack is coming from many different corners of our society, but it's being led by a couple of billionaire bullies, Bill Ackman, Chris Rufo. It's not a billionaire, but he's leading the charge. Elon Musk, all of you who are driving Teslas, know that you're supporting one of the main culprits who is attacking DEI. So let's get this conversation started, Fatima. With that as our backdrop, help us understand, you're an attorney, you've worked in this field for a while. How is it that DEI is being misinterpreted as being pretty much the cause of everything that's wrong in America?
Well, first, thank you. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today and to be on this panel. I will start out by saying, in terms of Bill Ackman, because you mentioned him before, all that we really need to know about Bill Ackman is that he said Kyle Rittenhouse was a patriot, right? And so what's going on is overt white supremacy on a broad scale. The bigger issue is, how do we counter it, right? Because this is a long-term plan that's been in place, and they are winning, and they are succeeding. And when we look at what's happening in these corporations, right, these letters are being sent out to law firms and they're retreating. They're getting scared. They're slashing budgets. They're getting rid of their chief diversity officers. And what we're witnessing in the corporate space and with these organizations is what I call profiles and no courage, because that is what is happening broad scale. But I like to think about and focus on what's the counter, what is the counteroffensive? And I think what we need to do, and at the organizations where you work, whether in government or the private sector, is that we need to put pressure on them. And what we also need to do is have a broad-scale counterattack. And what I would like to see is organizations flipping these rules back on these institutions. Like in Florida, for example, they come out with a law that says that you can't teach certain things because people are uncomfortable. And I don't see lawsuits on the other end. Why aren't people taking these lawsuits, taking these laws and saying, well, Black people and people of color, your school system is making me uncomfortable.
Great point. And since you mentioned what we are doing or not doing, I want to ask you, Naeem, the next question, because you work in the White House, you're working on a particular initiative related to historically Black colleges and universities. One of the things that we're hearing is a lot of Democrats are upset with the Biden-Harris administration, and they believe that that administration should be doing more to push back on DEI. Fatima talked about lawsuits, but what's happening at the White House level? There are calls for executive action by the president. Do you see any movement in that regard?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be with you all today. Just a quick point of clarity. The White House Initiative on HBCUs were housed within the Department of Education, reporting to the Secretary of Education and to the White House. So that's not exactly in the White House, right?
So in other words, you don't really.
I'm not on
House is
1600
doing.
Pennsylvania Avenue is what I'm saying. But what I can talk to is, going back to what was mentioned earlier, the affirmative action ruling. As soon as the affirmative action ruling came down, the president had the Department of Education and the Department of Justice work together, and within 45 days after reviewing the ruling, we came out with strategies for higher institutions of higher education and how to make sure that they're increasing diversity, equity within their student populations, right? And that's a public document. We also came together and did a summit to find best practices, which included, one, removing legacy admissions, which is actually the hugest barrier to folks getting into higher education from new backgrounds. But in addition to that, what was also in there was talking about how do we train admissions counselors in reviewing the whole of the student. So reviewing someone like me from Buffalo, New York, 14215 zip code, which is the poorest one in Buffalo, which was one of the third poorest cities in the country at the time of me growing up. But looking at me as a whole, my community service, the church I attended, my grade point average, and my background and what I overcame in order to be someone to go to college. So things like that. In addition to that, the president also has an executive order, and all the agencies have submitted equity action plans. So whether it's Department of Education, Energy, Commerce, USDA, all of our agencies have equity action plans and how we're going to weave inequity within the work that we're doing. From my perspective with HBCUs, it's how does not just the Department of Education work with HBCUs, but what is the Department of Energy doing? How is NSF, the National Science Foundation, how are they working with HBCUs? And we're making some demonstrable gains. We just had Spelman, Clark Atlanta, Morehouse just received a grant to build capacity, because that's the other thing that we need to focus on is our HBCUs have been underinvested in and undervalued for decades. So how do we begin to correct that? And it has to go beyond the $7 billion that this administration has put into HBCUs, and it's hypercharging that. So it's the Spelman Clark Atlanta funding. It's the funding that went to Voorhees to train teachers. The funding that went to Bowie University to train mental health professionals that look like us and can speak to the trauma and the concerns that our community has.
Great, and obviously anything that strengthens the Black colleges and universities in this country is a really good thing. So we salute the president, the vice president, the Office of Education, and everyone that's working in the White House to make that a reality. And we do know that these universities have been underfunded. There was just a big rally around Tennessee State, millions, or in fact billions of dollars that has not been funded to historically Black colleges. But Michael, while that's happening at the White House level, we also just saw this lawsuit, this ruling by a court that the Minority Business Development Office, a federal agency that was there to help disadvantaged businesses, that they can no longer use race as a qualifier. Socially disadvantaged now can be anyone. And basically, they have been directed to change their rulings or change their rules so that a white business owner that perhaps has not been disadvantaged in the way we think of disadvantaged historically can access services from that agency. So we may be giving something with our left hand, but with our right hand, we're taking away so many of the programs and policies that were helpful to get many of us where we are today. So help us understand that. Right. So Rodney, it seems like the folks that make the rules have the loudest voices. We saw this same fight as it relates to critical race theory. Those folks that would have everyone believe that critical race theory was being taught in elementary school. People that would conflate critical race theory with any topic about Black history. So now here we are again, after the racial reckoning we were having in this country, allegedly, right? After George Floyd's murder, when Black people were in conversations about systemic racism, those conversations, it was okay to have them. People were having them all over the country. DEI officers were being hired at the public and private level at record numbers. And less than 6 months after George Floyd's tragic murder, a lot of those gains we saw being reversed. What do you say to those folks that say we being the National Association of Public Administrators, those of us that work in DEI, those of us who support those policies, that we don't make enough noise, that we allow the right to control the narrative?
Well, I think it's important for the National Forum for Black Public Administrators to be at the forefront of pushing back on all of these efforts in whatever way they can. The difficulty we have is that every time there's progress, there's also a backlash to that progress, especially when it comes to African Americans. It's rooted in anti-Black racism, it's rooted in white supremacy. And a lot of the organizations that we're fighting right now have been on the forefront of this issue for a long time. They've just gotten increased funding because of money that's coming in from Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and these other anti-Black racists that happen to have billions of dollars. And so, you know, I was at the NFBPA forum with Maynard Jackson back in the early 90s, and we were talking about our response to the City of Richmond versus J.A. Croson case. And what we did was we looked at what the court said in that particular situation. We developed a disparity study, and then we put in place a new program, and we found new ways to respond to what the courts have said. And I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these attacks are really based on this most recent decision in Students for Fair Admissions. That comes from a line of cases that are really tied to diversity, this whole diversity argument. But most of the minority and women business programs, disadvantaged business enterprise programs, they're really coming from a different line of cases based on the Croson decision. And if you look at the Students for Fair Admissions case, in the main body of the opinion from Justice Roberts, he basically endorsed the approach of Croson, which is showing that there is discrimination, the present effects of past discrimination, and then using that as a basis for taking remedial action. And so from a legal standpoint, what we're doing is recognizing that we have to provide information to the administrators so that you can make modifications to your programs, to the things that you're doing to push back on what's going on in your state. Now, we know that if a governor comes in and he's reviewing your curriculum and he's doing other things, that there's only so much you can do as an administrator, but we recognize also that there are legal strategies at play that will allow us to push back. We're not going to roll over just because they're pushing and trying to conflate I'll leave it at that.
No, that's a great response. And you're right, the case about affirmative action in college admissions had nothing to do with the 30 pieces of legislation that have been introduced around the country to basically end DEI programs in public schools, higher education. But what people were doing, those on the right, I have a good friend who sits on a bunch of corporate boards. He told me that the corporations, lawyers, their general counsel are using that case and saying, well, we want to get ahead of it because we know it's coming, that train is coming, so we're going to get rid of our DEI folks now. We're going to end all of our programs, whether it's law firms that have diversity internships, whether it's financial firms that have diversity internships. So Fatima, Rodney just told us the legal case has not been made for the elimination of DEI, but yet folks are acting as if it has been made. So what do you do if you are a public administrator? You're in a city where you have a governor, like in Virginia, that has determined that they're going to review curriculum, or they are demanding. We see Austin, Texas just talks in Austin, UT, they just fired the entire DEI department, like 60 employees were laid off. A lot of these schools are renaming their departments, trying to avoid scrutiny. But what do you do? Let's talk about what this playbook looks like for public administrators.
Well, you know, one thing that I'll say, you know, about the lawsuit and the affirmative action case, right, and the Supreme Court decision, is that it is having impact already. I saw an article just the other day that talked about the impact at law schools, especially elite law schools, and the population of admitted Black students has gone down significantly. But in terms of what should people do in response to it, you know, I also focus on negotiating, and one thing that I say to my clients all the time is don't negotiate against yourself. You know, don't do their work for them. Make them force your hand. So when you have a lot of, again, these profiles of no courage, the general counsel of a corporation or an organization, whoa, sorry, I don't know what that was, sorry, it scared me. Okay. When you have you know, these companies that are retreating preemptively, right? It shows that they weren't even committed to it in the first place. But in terms of not negotiating against yourself, then what I think that you should do is start building coalitions within your community and other people who are like-minded, because to be able to hold firm to various programs and initiatives and maintaining opportunity for people of color, what is necessary is people being vocal about it. It's the political pressure, right? Why is Elon Musk, who I call Apartheid Claude, why is Bill Ackman, why are these people able to push these organizations? Is because they have power and there isn't a strong counter voice. So what I say in your communities, with
well, let me ask you, Fatima,
okay,
or anyone on the panel, where are those strong voices? They're billionaire Democrats, right? They're billionaires who are progressives, who we've heard Mark Cuban, for one. He's been very vocal about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the benefits of it, but we haven't seen a whole, you know, parade of folks that look like Mark Cuban and have the financial power and the platform of Mark Cuban. Where are they, Michael? I thought those were your bros, Michael.
At grassroots levels, with people who show up at on election day and make sure that the people they vote for are going to defend their interests. Now, that's easier said than done.
Now, wait a minute, and you know I agree with you on that.
Right.
When I talk about this all the time. So we're not going to win this war by billionaires or with billionaires, but there is something to be said about controlling the narrative.
Oh, no question about that.
So voting at the grassroots level, all of us voting, all of us doing everything we can do to make sure that we save our democracy is critical. But the narrative, it's the narrative that emboldens and empowers. That's why the narrative went from critical race theory to now DEI.
Right. So let me just say something about the narrative. You know, social media and non-traditional forms of media have helped level the playing field a little bit. There are influencers that you and I may not follow, but have platforms and followings, right? So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it won't take time, but I do believe that there is an ecosystem out there that's already in place, but has yet to be fully mobilized to push back on some of this stuff, particularly in our county governments and in our mid to large size cities across the country. because that, to me, is where this is actually going to end up being settled. Most of the talk is about what's going on at in Congress and at the federal court level. But as you know, so much of this stuff is being done at state Supreme Courts, state appeals courts, and to me, that's where a lot of our focus needs to be.
Well, you made a statement, and that's why I came down. You said you think this action, or you think there's more action that's happening inside public administrators' offices, right? In local government. So I just want to know, is anyone working as an administrator in a local governmental body where you see what Michael just described? Folks mobilizing, folks, coming together, forming coalitions and pushing back. Because we want to know where those models are, because they can be models that other folks can take back to their community and use. Does anybody see anything? All right, stand up, tell us about it.
Come to the microphone.
There's a mic there. And there's one over here. So yes, please state your name and tell us what county or city you're from.
Hey folks, my name is Maren Burnett. I'm here from King County, Washington State. There's a law in Washington State, it's called I-200. It essentially has said for over 10 years that you are not allowed as a government entity, as a business entity, to consider race in decision making. In order to get around that, multiple municipalities, including King County and the city, the Port of Seattle, have started using workarounds. They looked for the highest concentrations of folks who lived in particular zip codes, highest concentrations of folks who look like us, of folks who are immigrants, of folks who are furthest from economic justice, and used those zip codes to make decisions about where they should allocate resources. When that stopped working because gentrification happened, they've started moving more towards looking at the data, not saying black, not saying immigrant, but saying greatest need exists here. I'm gonna look at livability scores. I'm gonna look at education. I'm gonna look at poverty. And they overlay all of that data into an interactive map, which you can look at right now. It's Port of Seattle's Equity Index. The Port of Seattle started using the Equity Index as a way in which to decide where resources and grants should be allocated without having to say, we're sending this money to black folks. We're sending this money to immigrants. They're sending it where the greatest need exists and using the data that exists openly to decide where that is.
So let me ask you, since the Supreme Court decision was decided, and since we've seen these very vocal attacks on DEI, has anything changed with respect to the strategy?
To be honest, I was a chief strategy officer for the Port of Seattle for a number of years. I've just recently moved over to King County as a chief administrative officer. Within King County, there has been a push, and there's many King Countyers here with me. There has been a push to ensure that when we're talking about race and equity and inclusion, that there are EIB managers, those are equity and inclusion managers within each division of each department, to make sure that when we're talking about ESJ, for us that's equity and social justice, our county executive said, no, not just equity, racial equity. So now we have very specific focus on race as the baseline for how we make decisions about equity and social justice programming. King County is a very progressive place in a lot of respects, so I'm not sure that it works in other municipalities and for other populations, but the focus has been, yeah, that's what they're saying over there, but we have our own policies and we have our own agency, and so we want to make sure that we're still facilitating and creating spaces for people of color to come together and talk about what their needs are and what we can do to address them.
Great, thank you.
It's not perfect.
No, great, thank you for sharing that. Is there anyone who is in a state that is not as progressive as Washington? Because what we've heard from Michael, Florida, Texas, some of the southern states, the challenges may be different. If you're in the Midwest, a state like Missouri, state like Ohio, some red states, anybody in one of those states or in a red county that has had to get creative with how you are addressing these issues in light of the attacks? Okay, you're all from California, right? Everybody's from a progressive state. Nobody's from a a red state. No one's from a conservative state. No Texas folks. All right, you're from Texas. Stand up. Okay, you live there. Okay, so you come to the mic. Thank you. Texas has been in the news a lot because Texas is one of those states. I just talked about UT. Wiped out all of its DEI folks.
Crazy governor.
Yes, you do. So tell us what you do.
I run the Mental Health Authority for Bexar County, which is San Antonio, Texas.
So what kinds of changes are you seeing in your agency, if any, with these attacks?
The last legislative session, the legislators proposed a bill that would prohibit my psychiatrist and my other providers from seeing children who were going through the transition process. And they were very afraid of losing their license. And it's been very difficult to navigate that with the families of those children who are really in need of those services to fulfill their lives and to reach their full potential. So it's been very stressful for those providing that service as well as the families that we serve.
I'm glad you brought that issue up of transgender kids because we know this attack on DEI is not just about race. It's about the LGBTQ
It's everybody.
community.
It's everybody
women.
who doesn't look like them.
Absolutely. So my next question is, who has been working, building alliances, coalitions with other groups, whether it's white women, whether it's LGBTQ community? Because I would venture to say, Rodney, in this moment, is that one of the strategies we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the things I think we ought to recognize is that this is all about politics. You know, at the end of the day, the election that's coming up is critical. And I think that one of the things that's going on right now is that so many of the initiatives, there have been powerful initiatives that the Biden administration has put in place. Reparations for African-American farmers and other types of very strong initiatives for HBCUs, other types of initiatives in the area of minority and women business. Many of them have been struck down at the lower court levels. And why? Because for 4 years we had very conservative judges put in place. Why are we having these kinds of legal attacks? Because the President of the United States for 4 years was putting in place people who had been vetted by the Federalist Society. And they're going in foreign shopping in small districts in Texas where they know they're going to get a conservative judge. And so we've got to be very intentional about recognizing that this election is going to make a huge difference in terms of what the narrative is. The narrative is going to be changed by the reality. The reality of it is that if there is an election that results in the Republican nominee being selected, what we're going to see, in fact, is not just a rollback of DEI, but they're talking about a repeal of Executive Order 11246, which was put in place in the 1960s and which has a lot to do with why many of us are sitting in this room, because you got those jobs because there was pressure put on those governments to hire black folk, put on industry to hire black folk. They're talking about a complete repeal of the employment sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And don't forget that in 1991, the Civil Rights Act of 1991 was put in place to restore the disparate impact test. That caused a lot of consternation on the right. It caused Pat Buchanan to run against George H.W. Bush. So we need to recognize that we're talking about a real threat to our employment. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about basically putting us in a position as close as possible to our former condition of servitude. And we need to recognize what's at stake in this election.
Well, to that point, the representative of that nominee has said they are going to root out every discriminatory program and practice in the federal government. And when they use discriminatory in their language, what they mean is any program or policy that they think advantages any group that's not white men. Because they've done surveys, and white men in this moment feel like they are being discriminated against, and that anyone that is not advancing the causes of white men is a racist. And they are making it very difficult to even have these conversations, Fatima, because if you have these conversations, you get labeled as a racist. So I want to go back to my question about allyship. We talked a lot about that after George Floyd's murder. A lot of conversations about being in allyship. Is this a moment where you think we should be working harder to form those kinds of allyships? Now, a lot of folks say they didn't work after George Floyd, so why are they going to work now? They say we saw what happened. White women disappointed us in many ways. But what are you feeling in this moment? Is there any sense that somebody else other than us are feeling the pressure?
Well, to your point earlier, I mean, I think it is important to build coalitions across group lines, right? So people in the trans community and with women, right? All of the marginalized groups that are being attacked, so that there's more of a collective power. And I'll say that this is a very difficult time. I mean, I've had conversations with law firms and companies and foundations and people in academia, because I'm trying to figure out, like, who are some of these people beyond, like a Mark Cuban or some of these, a handful of organizations like the Urban League or the NAACP that, let's be honest, frankly, doesn't have the same amount of power that it had, some decades ago. And I am struggling trying to find who are the voices, for building these coalitions, because I see broad-scale apathy. Apathy even in our own community, in the Black community. And I feel there are too many people waiting for someone else, right? So it's like, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? So I encourage everyone here, because, we don't have the answers because there's this broad-scale attack. But what is imperative is for all of us to step up in this moment. If you don't want to have a broad-scale unraveling of everything, they've packed the courts, like he was saying, right? And we have to cross over and build these coalitions with women and these other groups. This woman has her hand up, so that we can counter what is happening. So yes, building the coalitions is critical to counter the narrative.
I love the word apathy, and I want to ask someone that's under 35 in this room. Anybody under 35 or 35-ish? All right, come on up here. You're real close to the mic, so you have the shortest walk. You have the shortest walk. You can go, I'm gonna get you next, but I want to ask her. So, there's this narrative that younger voters aren't paying attention, don't necessarily appreciate the dire situation that's just been described, and some say they're not going to vote at all. Some say they're going to vote for the Republican because they had, they got that stimmy. They got the stimmy, right? Some say they're voting for the third-party candidate because both of the Democratic and Republican candidates are too old. So tell us, the younger voters that you are in touch with, what are they thinking, and how do we impress upon them the urgency of this moment?
Yeah, so I really didn't give that, I'm gonna have to give that some thought. But I will say too, is that I don't think we often realize some of the monumental moments that some of the younger generation has experienced throughout the years. Like, some of us were born during 9/11, and, seeing the political climate that we have now. So I think we always want to create the narrative where, like, our ancestors fought for us to be in these times where we could vote and have these opportunities. While I think that is also true, I also think we shouldn't dismantle the moment that we're in now, where people are fatigued with hearing the same narratives over and over again of, like, it's so much better than it was back in the day, but we're having new experiences where people just don't feel that they can trust government right now. So I think we just need to acknowledge, the struggles that we're experiencing here in current times.
So she's saying that they don't feel heard. Okay. So anybody that's over 35, make sure you are listening. That's a good point, because younger voters need to be heard. And we need to stop telling you about what we did for you, because you don't care. You don't care if we walked to school in the rain 8 miles, or if we didn't eat to feed you. That is not your issue. You just want to be heard in this moment. So we are all going to pledge, all of y'all that's over 35, I'm with her, but all you other older people are going to pledge to listen to our younger voters because we need them in close elections. I mean, literally, the margins can be so close. If younger voters sit home because they do feel like they're not being heard or that their issues aren't being recognized and acknowledged, then we could lose the election and we all will suffer. You wanted to?
Areva.
Go ahead, jump in. Thank you.
While they're coming to the microphone, I just want to say quickly, you know, I've been teaching 18 to 24-year-olds now for 20 years, and I've seen some real changes in my college students over time. And I just wanted to underline one point that I think is really important. The kids are not all right, okay? When you're talking about a pandemic, a financial downturn, a housing meltdown in 2008, and 9/11, right? If you are 35-ish like I am, ish, right? You know, we've seen a lot, right? So I just wanted to point out that, you know, historically, whether it's now or 20 years ago or 40 years ago, 18 to 30-year-olds are the least consistent voters, so we understand that. But there's some encouragement that this group right now needs, and we all need to jump in on this, because if they can't be brought into the system and it's just distrust of government, then that means they go and listen to whoever it is that might be lying to them about whatever's going on wrong with government.
No, that's right, and we all have an obligation to do that. You have the stage.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I'm Eric Russell Jr. I'm a junior sales associate here with Prison Compliance Management. I'm a recent graduate of Morehouse College. I graduated last May of 2023.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, my brother.
I just wanted to say, just to piggyback on my colleague, I wouldn't say that we necessarily are not involved. A lot of people within our age just don't know.
Point.
This isn't taught in schools. I know when I graduated high school, we had a small government class. They called it civic government. I didn't know any of this. We didn't have to know any of this. It was just, hey, y'all got to take a test on the basic stuff.
Right.
And you graduate. I mean, it was nothing serious. None of that was really taken serious. I actually did a project my senior year of high school where we talked about the importance of voting and how most of the people my age don't know that it starts locally. You can't get anywhere nationally without being able to vote locally.
Great point. No, that's an excellent point. And to the point of not knowing, particularly Rodney's point about the courts, very few people associate what the president does with who ends up on these courts. And it's not just the Supreme Court. We hear a whole lot about Clarence Thomas and the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, but a lot of these cases that we're talking about, they started with those conservative judges that are on district courts. They are trial judges. They are appellate court judges. They are too appointed by the president. And when Donald Trump was in office, he appointed an insane number of judges. It was a part of the agenda of those working in his administration to pack the courts. And even if we are successful in winning the House, the Senate, and the White House, we are still left with those tenured judges who have a lifetime tenure on those federal courts. And the Biden-Harris administration has to be very careful about what they challenge. Because one thing you don't want to do as a lawyer is take a losing case to the higher court and get a ruling like we now have in the affirmative action cases, and that becomes precedent. So sometimes we're upset with the administration about not challenging a particular lower court ruling, but it's strategy on their part, trying not to have a particular ruling enshrined in the law. So we've got a lot of work to do. Even, like I said, if we win all 3 branches of government, we still have this court. Maybe there'll be court reform, maybe not, but that is an important issue. And to Eric's point about education, educating younger voters, our neighbors, whomever, about that tie, that connection is so important.
So good afternoon. My name is Linda Jordan. I'm from the Atlanta chapter. I'm on the business side, but I think this can relate to the administrators as well. So a number of us, you spoke about allies, right? And a number of us in the organizations, for instance, I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And number two, I'm also the social justice chair for the National Council of Negro Women. And on April the 25th, we're having a session in Atlanta that Rodney Strong from Atlanta will be on regarding the Fearless Fund. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with that, but it's a nonprofit 501c3 that two female, actually three, because Keisha Knight Pullman, also a SARA, is a partner in that. So they have this organization basically set up to be able to help women of color with their businesses, giving out small grants, not some large amounts of money, maybe like 25, 30,000, but they have affected a number of females, over 1,500. And right now they're being sued by a conservative called Edward Blum, and he's suing a lot of people in that space, right, or trying to. And so that's why we need Rodney. This session is going to be in Atlanta on April the 25th at the Russell Innovation Center. And we're asking other organizations to participate with us. But my point is that this will have some ramifications for a lot of us, because if that is in the appellate court, I believe now, Rodney might be able to speak to it more than I, but just know that it would affect a lot of us that are in business, because if they strike that down, some other things could happen after that. So I'm passionate about this subject matter because I am a woman of color and I have my own business. So with that, Rodney, would you like to add some comments to it? Thank you.
Well, they just had the 11th Circuit.
You know, one thing about people from Atlanta is that sometimes they just take over the host job, but
That's all right. That's all right, sister to sister. But they just had that argument, and a friend of mine was working with the Fearless Fund. She said that argument didn't go that well. I don't know if you were there, Rodney.
yeah, I was. The district court opinion was a favorable opinion. We got a judge. In fact, I've appeared before that judge before. He's a progressive judge, made a good decision, I thought. Got to the 11th Circuit, it did not go well at all. And the 11th Circuit took a very hostile position toward the idea of making decisions, based on race, without, factual predicate, which is just a legal term that just means you have to do some kind of fact finding and some other kinds of things. And so that case is very problematic. We're looking at it from all angles because there's a lot of concern about whether or not that case should be taken for the very reason that you were discussing to the Supreme Court, or whether we should let that 11th Circuit case stand and then move to shore up things by doing some other kinds of things to prepare those kinds of organizations. Just had a conversation this morning with some folks about that.
That's a real issue. And you heard in my bio, I'm representing a bunch of families around reparations. And the lawyers who are working in the reparations space, we have decided to try to avoid taking any case up, because the last reparations case, going all the way back to the Tulsa, Oklahoma case that Johnny Cochran and Charles Ogletree took up to the Supreme Court, they lost. It's the Supreme Court in Oklahoma just heard arguments on the Tulsa, Oklahoma case on, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, but it's on the issue of public nuisance. But still, there's concern that when we take cases up right now that have to do with race in any shape or form, we lose the opportunity to have a fair hearing, because we have judges who've been appointed by Trump in many cases, and we can really do more damage to our causes right now than good. So it'll be interesting to see what you guys ultimately decide on that case. That's the Fearless Fund. Again, it's a Black-led organization providing funding for small African-American owned businesses, and the courts are saying, no, can't do that. If you're going to give money to Black people, you got to give it to white people, brown people, green people, everybody. And they're basically wiping out this notion of disadvantaged, socially disadvantaged, or really turning the Civil Rights Act on its head. And this notion that somehow we are getting more than what we deserve. And it all goes back to the white supremacy narrative, Fatima, that if we just worked a little harder, we wouldn't need these programs. And the whole notion of leveling the playing field has really been turned on its head. Go ahead, Donna, welcome.
Thank you.
man, my spirit is boiling. I've been in business 30 years. I'm a fourth-generation entrepreneur. I watched my father struggle, and I believe his struggles is what caused him to die at 61. And I just turned 60. I know y'all don't believe that, but I'm like you. I'm under 35.
You're
but
fabulous.
yeah.
You're
Yes.
fabulous.
But I watched him struggle. I watched our communities transform. Our main street is full of vacant housing. It used to be vibrant and full of Black-owned businesses. And I feel like we have been set back, and this is the ultimate thing that could take our community back to days that we just cannot even imagine. But as a 30-year business owner, I have struggled to be in business and to grow my business because of the discriminating factors against women in business, being in IT, the lack of funding that comes to Black women-owned businesses, women businesses, period, right? There is nothing that anyone can say that our businesses are more advantaged than the white male-owned firms that I compete with every day. They are funded 99.9% of equity funding. We get less than 1%. There is no way that anyone could prove that we're getting any advantage when we're stepped on and oppressed by the very policies that are in place right now. And there's got to be something, whether it's legal, that can go up against and show that discrimination that is the direct, opposite of what they are putting out. And Rodney, I am challenged with this. I'm a business person, I'm not a lawyer, but we have got to do something because any of these aspiring young people will be in no position without these programs that will at least give them a place to step into something if these kinds of things go forward. And I employ every Divine Nine organization, every national Black, Hispanic, and every other organization to do exactly what you said. We have got to come together. We have got to align and use these young people to get on TikTok, because I don't know if Rodney can dance that well, and I certainly can, but get them on TikTok with the right messages and use the media to get the messaging to them so they vote in the right manner.
Yeah, one thing, great points, Donna. Donna, unfortunately, we're not fighting facts. The facts are clear. Companies do better economically when they have diverse workforces, when they have diverse managers, when they have diverse folks in senior level positions. This isn't about money. This isn't about facts. We are in this weird moment in our history where facts don't matter. People just lie. They just lie about the facts. And they get away with it. And we all have to be clear-eyed about this. This is about the browning of the country. This is about the browning of the country. This is about the fact that we are going to be the minority majority. And people are afraid. And people are voting not in their own best interest, not in their own best economic interest. They're voting and they are supporting candidates that support white supremacy and the hierarchical structure that has been in place in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years. So at least we got to start out with the truth. And we have to recognize that that's what it is. And when people try to tell you you're racist, you have to push back on that. Or when they try to say that we are somehow getting something, Donna, that we don't deserve, we know factually that's not true. We're getting 1/10 of what others get, but yet it doesn't matter. So I was told by this man over here, so you all get him, not me, that this very interesting conversation that they gave us, 45 minutes to solve the whole DEI. I don't know. They gave us 45 minutes to come up with a playbook. We got the best experts in the world here, but they're saying we got 2 minutes. So.
No. It's too important of a conversation.
Okay, so
I'm the co-chair of the Public Policy Committee.
Okay, so the co-chair, the president, and the new president, you all make an executive decision because you. But you go. Let's let her go first, and then you can go. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, because you are standing here first. I want to acknowledge that. The question has been about what is the new strategy, what is the chess move in order to change the face of the way that people see DEI. One of the things that has to be revisited over and over again are the implications of removing DEI beyond race, beyond gender. You have to educate people about the fact that we're talking about grandchildren who have Tourette's or are neurodivergent, who will not be employed because of their uniqueness. And that's white, that's blue, that's purple. We are not having a broad enough or sophisticated enough conversation about the duty to do no harm, as opposed to celebrating difference. There aren't legal ramifications for whether or not you celebrate difference, but there are legal ramifications when you fail to uphold the duty to do no harm. And what people don't realize is that when you have a conversation about the removal of DEI practices, you promote a duty to do harm to people who are not the face of DEI. We have people who are differently abled who reap benefit from DEI practices and principles. People, children who are on the Asperger, who are on the autism spectrum and representing populations of those navigating, living with, and thriving with Asperger's who would not be considered for our workforce if it were not for DEI concepts. And so when you talk to people and you make DEI solely about the implications of racial representation, you forget the other elements of representation that do matter to people who are of the majority and think that this is just about race, but when they know that what they overturn means their grandchildren, their children won't be considered because of difference, it's a different educational approach. And I think we are missing that boat horrifically because of the fact that we are so committed to making sure that we don't let our race down, which is important, but it's also about the intersections of who we are. And if we don't have that discussion, that is what's going to leave DEI more at stake, just in my opinion.
Well, thank you for that, because I live at that intersection. I am a mother of a son on the autism spectrum. I run an organization wholly dedicated to individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities, mental health issues, that live at that intersectionality. And I wish that I could get some of our majority folks to recognize that. I've not seen that be a mover, but in this fight, we're gonna use every tool, every strategy that's available to us. And I liken that to the folks in Kentucky and some of the other states where you see poor white people who benefited from the child tax credit, benefited from so many of the federal government programs, but yet they continue to vote for people who vote against those programs, even though it's taking food off the table of their autistic child or their autistic adult. So they know that they will lose those benefits, but yet their whiteness and maintaining white supremacy is more important. And they've been brainwashed in a lot of ways and been made to believe that somehow we are, as immigrants, we see how they're vilified in the media, that somehow they're the enemy. Hold one second, I gotta get him in, and then this guy's gonna like mow me over, so come on. Oh, tell us your name. Dr. Love Jones.
Yes, my name is Dr. Love Jones, and I'm the Director of Human Rights with the City of Greensboro.
Fabulous, thank you, Dr. Jones.
Real being mindful of time, Mark Washington, City Manager of Grand Rapids, and also NFBPA board member. I want to just real quickly comment on the apathy comment earlier and call to action, what we can do. I think those of us who are in progressive states, who are in progressive cities, sometimes get insulated with our progressiveness and not pay attention to what's happening around us. And so similar to the civil rights movement, earlier in the 60s, when there was attention from states other than the South calling to issue some of the things that were going on. I think we need more of that. I'm so proud of NFBPA for recognizing the need to have that kind of attention, and would ask that we consider what other things we can do, as my colleague Donna said earlier, to have more national organizations express outrage of what we're seeing, even if it's not in the cities and states that we live in order to have some kind of more national attention to these issues.
That's a great point. It also goes to the point of voting. Those of us who live in states where we know the Democrats are going to win, we've got to leave those states. So if you're in California, you got to go to Nevada. You've got to, not move there, but I mean, go there and volunteer or get on the phone and do phone banking. We've got to help in those places where we know it's going to be more challenging. So thank you for that point.
All right, hello, my name is Miles Spann from Durham County, North Carolina. And some of the things that I want to touch on really quickly is I think one of the biggest issues with a lot of the younger generation is not necessarily apathy, but it's fatigue. Yes. We go through a constant cycle of everyone telling us this is the biggest challenge of our life, we have to do this, this is the most important election. And then we do that, we show up, and then all those promises that have been made to protect certain rights, certain things that they have said, falls flat. Specifically when we're talking about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That falling apart is gonna impact 3 generations down the line. When we talk about Roe v. Wade, we talk about all these different things that happen because we said, hey, we show up, we vote people in that say that they're gonna fight for us, and then they give up. And then they expect us to come back every 4 years, every 2 years. And that's a continuous process that is fatigue. So my question, and even somebody like myself, I am over community engagement, but the question becomes is, when fatigue happens, how do we renew people so that they continue to fight and knowing that their leaders will continue to fight also? And not be bought out.
Can I make a quick?
Excellent question. I just want to say something about that. That's a really good question. And we hear that a lot from young people with student loan debt relief, right? Folks frustrated about that in addition to the high cost of living, inflation, people going to the grocery store can't afford groceries, the high cost of living, how much it costs to buy a home or to get into the home market. So very legitimate question. I'm going to let each of you give like a really quick response and then give us a closing, like 30 seconds. Obviously, we have to have more time, have to come back next year and continue this conversation. But let me start with Michael, then we'll go this way. If you want to respond to that question and then give us your closing thoughts about what people can do. So, keep it tight.
So that question speaks to a real frustration I have as a college professor, and that is, civically, we have too many people that think that 400-year problems can be fixed in an election or two. Right? I can't tell you how many people I know who are upset with that the world didn't change when Barack Obama got elected president, right? And so I would just quickly point out that, you know, the forces on the other side are showing up at every election. So you have to show up at every election too.
Yes.
And so, in the interest of time, I'll just leave it there. I'm just saying you can't win if you don't show up.
Great point. Thank you.
Well, one thing I'll say is, you know, fatigue is not unique to people who are just a hair younger than me, you know, because I get very fatigued. You know, I was talking in the green room with Michael that I wrote an article in The Hill that's entitled, "Biden Must Work Harder to Earn This Black Woman's Vote." You know, and I've been very disappointed with many things in the Democratic Party, but what I think is very critical, and you may not like this answer, but it's a realistic answer, is people just have to push through the fatigue. You know, I mean, I think it was interesting. I was doing a talk about my book, and somebody asked me about like self-care, right? Because my book is about racism. And, you know, they're like, well, what do you do about self-care? And I'm like, yeah, that's important, but I also recognize there's a bigger problem at play, and so I might just have to suck it up and deal and push through it. You know, and I'm glad that you brought up voting, because one thing I wanted to bring up when people were talking about diversity is that this is linked to another issue, and I'm glad you brought up the voting John Lewis bill, because it's important to vote. in this upcoming election for people who are down ballot. Because that is what's going to impact what's happening, whether or not that John Lewis bill goes through. Because while they're attacking DEI, they're also attacking the Voting Rights Act in the courts, and they're dismantling Section 2, all these different sections of the Voting Rights Act. So it's important to push through, and I know Michael said, I know I have to be quiet soon, is going to be writing a book about voting, so I'm just putting in a plug for your book. And I'll put in a plug for mine because I have a whole chapter on voting rights that I'll be signing on outside. But I think it's just sadly, you have to barrel through.
And Fatima, you can say very loudly that you wrote a book and invite people to meet you on the 3rd floor to buy it, and you will sign it.
I will sign it. My book is entitled Race Rules, What Your Black Friend Won't Tell You, and it is the quiet part out loud.
Yes, and support her and that book. All right. Thank you. Rodney.
Yeah, I just want to say that very succinctly, we just have to work harder at political education. You know, one of the things that came through in the comments of all of the people that are, you know, like me, 35-ish, was that, you know, there's not enough emphasis anymore on understanding the process. And so people get upset about the John Lewis bill not passing because, but it didn't pass because of the filibuster. But if you don't understand what happened, you know, it's hard to explain that. So that's the main answer I would give to what you have to say, which is that we have to work at the grassroots level. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that in Georgia, we have an organization called the Democracy Alliance that has got a lot of funders that come in and give their funds to that organization, and that organization gives money to the grassroots organization. They've been doing work now for the last 4 years. Christine White has that organization. They've been doing a tremendous job. And I believe that, quite frankly, we will probably win Georgia this year because the grassroots people have been on the ground.
Great.
And I think it's important to continue to do that. And then finally, I just want to say, just to wrap up my comments all together, is that we have to recognize that we all have to do everything we can do to win this election, because a lot is at stake. Because this time, we're really facing a much more ferocious attack than we faced in a long time.
Thank you, Rodney. And you have the last word.
Yep.
Name.
I would say to focus on, I got my start working in government, working for the city of Buffalo, New York. First black mayor of the city of Buffalo. The thing that we always focus on, the thing that I would say for young people to focus on, is the steps that are being made to move forward. So, for instance, with the student loan, with student debt forgiveness, student debt relief, you know, back in 2008 when I started college, that wasn't even a conversation. Now we are 14 years later, and $138 billion of student loan debt has been forgiven.
Yes.
From something that wasn't even a conversation. So keep moving forward. The other thing on fatigue, going back again to 2008, I don't recall how many Obama for President videos I saw. I think there's 3 of them. 2 of them were from will.i.am on YouTube. I say that to say we're all plugged into so many different things. Don't fully disengage, but do monitor how plugged in you are.
Great point. And to that point about student loan debt not even being a conversation, reparations, as many of you know, was a fringe conversation just 20, 30 years ago. And now around the country, governors and mayors and local entities are talking about reparations, and reparations is moving. And Charles Ogletree and Johnny Cochran took that case to the Supreme Court. They lost, but that's okay, because they laid the foundation for a generation after them to come behind them and pick up the mantle of reparations. So everything that happens in this country, our fight for democracy, is not won in one generation. We all have a responsibility to keep pushing further and further, acknowledge the shoulders that we stand on and the great work that's been done by those that came before us, but then ask ourselves, what are we doing? And we can't be so focused on the perfect that we forget about the good. There's been a lot of good that's happened in this administration, a lot of good that's happened in this country. Are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. But are we further than where we were 10, 20 years ago? Absolutely yes. So as I end this conversation, I just want to, one, say to the president, thank you. Obviously a big conversation. We didn't get to cover everything we wanted to, but if nothing else, I think we impressed upon everyone how critical this issue is. And please go back, use your platforms, use your positions, your cachet in your community to make sure folks are talking about this, convening about this, and working on solutions, because we can't ever, ever give up the fight. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to certainly thank Areva and the panel for this discussion this afternoon. We do know that there are a number of key statements made, but I want to impress upon us the importance of the initial thing that we got to do first, which is we got to go vote. We got to vote. We got to put our finger in the dike, go vote. And then we're going to be talking, because this is being live streamed. And so we will be talking and we will be summarizing some actionable items that we're going to recommend that NFBPA will take as part of outreach to our membership so that we are helping to close the information gap and make sure that for the young people that are feeling like they're not being listened to or heard, that we hear you, but we need to coalesce around the important issues and prioritize them. So thank you. I appreciate the fact that you've stayed with us. We're way over time, but this was an important discussion. Let's give them a round of applause as we leave. And